Now, obviously, as Final Fantasy has a huge influx of World of Warcraft players who are just here hanging out. Maybe some to stay, maybe some just to kill time till June 29th. There has been a number of comparisons in what is the equivalent piece of content, what is the translation, and I've definitely taken my part in that. And today, there was a couple of follow-up questions after I did some translating for some new players, where the question was, why does the same piece of content in one game not fare as well as the same piece of content in another game? Obviously, both games are not exactly identical, and you're going to have gross oversimplifications to make them marry up, because if you have 10 things that a game needs to do, it might break that up into 3 separate pieces of content as 3, 3, and 4, and another game may break that into like 5, 3, and 2. And so taking one piece of content and holding it up to another when a piece of content does multiple things for a game, it's not perfect. And the question today was about Torghast versus Deep Dungeon. Torghast is World of Warcraft's newest roguelike experience added to the game, and it basically gives you the chance to progress through a tower where there's these different floors, and you're choosing from this kind of card deck of modifications that alter your class in crazy and bizarre ways that allow you to progress through it. It gets harder and harder. They're talking about adding more and more, and the primary reason that people do it is to get access to Soul Ash, a requirement for the legendary system, to get this gear that is needed and relevant to whatever game mode it is that they're taking part in, especially raiding. That means it's required. If you like it, that's no big deal. If you don't like it, that is. But that also means that you need to be clearing a little bit of it each and every week. So even if you like it, taking a week off is a mistake if your goal is to stay on the top end of PvE content. This doesn't impact the vast majority of very casual players, because missing a week is no big deal. Maybe they just say, screw it, I just won't engage. But to people who really feel like they just want to play well at the game and they constantly are seeking to get better, it can feel very frustrating when gear is in the way, and the answer to get whatever that gear or consumable or buff or whatever it is locked behind a piece of content that feels totally separate and fragmented from behind your progression. It is not raiding that gets you your Soul Ash, it's Torghast. Final Fantasy in Heavensward introduced a system called Deep Dungeon. This is a leveling progression thing. The first one was called Palace of the Dead. It's a 200-floor roguelike experience, kind of. And you go in parties of 1 to 4, 4 being our dungeon-sized parties, and you progress all the way to the top. Now, at the time it was released, that content, I believe the weapons that you could get from it were like, I think they were like the extreme weapons where they were relevant for a time, but they very quickly faded from existence. They don't continually upgrade. You're not going to need them ever again. And so the vast majority of the history of either Deep Dungeon, Palace of the Dead, or its second chapter of it in Stormblood, Heaven on High, is for cosmetics. Clearing them has a leaderboard on the website. Clearing them solo is one of the hardest PvE achievements you can manage in-game. Clearing all 200 floors of Palace of the Dead, or all 100 floors of Heaven on High. Going into Shadowbringers, you see the trend, 100 less floors each time. They drop us to 0 floors added in Shadowbringers with no Deep Dungeon. And they are shocked that where they took the features that they thought Deep Dungeon was serving, and they implanted them in other content, the ability to level alts and things like that, a huge source of cosmetics, but there isn't a true Deep Dungeon. And they said they're shocked at how many people aren't satisfied by those other implementations of those features and really just wanted a Deep Dungeon, because I assume they were looking at analytics and not that many people were doing it. And so when the community lashed back, they said we were looking for a way to get that into Endwalker 6.0 releasing this November. I assume with it not being confirmed yet, if they do get it in, that would be something like a 6.3 launch, so it's at least a year out, halfway through the expansion, remembering that Final Fantasy gets 5 patches through every expansion, 0.1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and half patches tied to each of those. So I assume we're talking about a 6.3, 6.35, if I had to put a guess on it. The question was, why is Torghast received with such animosity compared to Deep Dungeon, where when it was removed, or in theory fixed by the game, the community was actually incredibly frustrated. And I think a lot of that comes down to how it's implemented. I was listening to Sloot on stream the other day, who is an incredible World of Warcraft player, who plays a variety of other games. I've sat there and lurked and watched him play Power Washing Simulator. And he has like a really logical, reasonable way to talk about kind of the pendulum of gear treadmills. And as you talk about the pendulum of gear treadmills, One of the frustrating things in World of Warcraft is that the things like the legendary system, things like these Azurite necklaces, these various things that are tied to your item level and your progression and your ability to move forward in raids, while they do have a catch-up mechanic of sorts, it's always best to be playing a little every single week as opposed to trying to catch up later. The groups that are here every single week come out on top, and that forces everybody that wants to keep up with those people to do it whether they like it or not. These power grinds aren't inherently bad, these long grinds. Final Fantasy has them. They're tied to a system called Relic. Now, what World of Warcraft does currently is they tie power progression through staying on that track the whole way, and so should you ever fall behind, the front of the train just charges on without you. And now behind the exponential things through various Azurite power and all that, they've stopped people from progressing too far ahead of the train, but the front of the train has a healthy pack at the front of it, and so they're always getting to that next chapter of power release before everybody else, and so it's a huge advantage to stay with the pack. Final Fantasy's Relic system is very similar to this, and so to jump back and forth between game terminologies, I'm going to talk about the Relic. So the Relic is a system that releases on the half patches throughout a Final Fantasy expansion, and that gear is mostly cosmetic. You basically get it, instead of by clearing the hardest content through the game with Savages and Extremes, you get it through doing whatever it is they ask of you. Sometimes that's the equivalent of going out and doing world events, sometimes that's the equivalent of running old dungeons or old raids, or sitting in a new zone that's kind of their answer to the Maw. And there's various ways to do it. The current Relic expansion, actually, for each step, for the vast majority of the steps, all the ones I can think of, they give you two options. They say you can either go run the equivalent of kind of a Chromie time walking type thing for World of Warcraft players, or you can come into this current Maw type zone and grind it out there. And those are really your choices. Your first Relic is very lengthy, but there are some big chapter steps that once those are complete, all extra relics, because you can get them for all 18 battle jobs in the game, get easier because those steps are once per character. But for effectively Final Fantasy compared to World of Warcraft, that can be per account for the vast majority of players, because having an alternate character only has a handful of uses within 14, and so it is the less common way to play. The Relic, on its other hand, tends to just keep you casually geared in your weapon slot. It doesn't ever really get best in slot until the last half patch of the last patch of the expansion, the 0.55 patch. The 0.55 to the 0.0 of the next expansion doesn't really have a world first race or any battle content to it. So the Savage and Extreme Raiders don't really get locked out or pushed to the side because it's suddenly best in slot. The ones who've been doing both have it, and it replaces their Savage or Extreme weapon. But the ones who haven't, it's fine. Let them have their fun. It's not hurting anybody. It's helping these casuals maybe get through Savage after it's already lost its relevance. Get that clear or something for the first time with a weapon that's 5 item levels better. Most importantly, even if it's the same item level, because I don't know exactly how that stacks out, it's more stat optimized. Either way, it's a slight advantage to Relic, and it's not really relevant to the world first race. The rest of the expansion, it kind of sits down in that second or third best in slot, which is plenty high for a casual player that doesn't want to go fight through to get through the hardest content in the game, but still low enough that the highest level players feel like if it doesn't matter to them, it doesn't matter to them. And so it's a really neat thing. The system has also allowed you over various expansions to do it different ways. And so the current one, for example, allows you to level up alternate jobs while getting the drops you need, assuming that they're 71 or greater. And so if you're leveling up those jobs, imagine going into Shadowlands and doing Threads of Fate or doing Torghast on a leveling character and getting the Soul Ash you need for your main. And so it's a really nice way to feel like you're kind of double dipping. I'm getting the Soul Ash I need, and I'm leveling up this character I'd been meaning to get to cap eventually anyway. So that's kind of how the Relic system works. Now you can see how the Relic system plus the Deep Dungeon system starts to create a really interesting take on kind of where the Torghast, Maw, and Legendary system comes in, because you're not really forced to do any of it. You don't have to do the Relic, you don't have to do Deep Dungeon, and I think that's where the friction is. I think a lot of the frustration is not being told, here's some great content, please enjoy it, give it a shot, here, play it at your pace. It's that it is tied behind this requirement. And what Sloot talked about there being is, instead of equally incrementing these, why don't we slam that power up to the front end? Now that doesn't mean burn all the power up by the 0.1 patch. That means, hey, maybe the first 5 or 10 hours that you put in, whatever that increment is that's deemed reasonable, within a patch cycle, gets you the power that's locked behind that patch cycle, right? Through getting a new consumable or whatever it is. And then all the time after that, if they want to have these endless grinds available, why not tie cosmetics and quality of life behind that? Why not shorten my Hearthstone in Shadowlands? Why not allow me to go and get a second Covenant? Why not allow me to get unique mount skins or minions or whatever? And it can be to varying effects. The ability to transfer to another Covenant is something that a top-end raider would need, but a casual player would say, I'm fine with this Relic anyway. And so you could even make the Relic, you could even make the Covenant hopping locked behind, maybe immediately behind that power progression. This is my own suggestions, not Sloot's, so don't go get mad at him at that point. So imagine if once you had the eye level capped out, or once you got your legendary and you got the legendary you wanted, that maybe the next thing you unlock is the ability to switch Covenants faster. Maybe the next thing you unlock is the ability to go Hearthstone to your Covenant more often, or the ability to kind of keep your progression within a Covenant, or accelerate your renown gain, or something like that. Something where it doesn't really impact the core experience to somebody that wants to play one character through one Covenant and experience normal or LFR raids. They're not feeling like, I gotta go get my Soul Ash this week, or else, like, that shouldn't be a requirement. I think the difference here is that World of Warcraft has learned about what a retention mechanic is, something that allows players to stay in the game and stay engaged, and they've made everything a retention mechanic. And there can't just be, let's just see if the content's good enough. And if people leave, we'll know it's not. And if people stay, we'll know it is. Instead, everybody leaving is leaving out of frustration, and everybody staying is staying out of frustration. You're not getting any actionable data through your analytics. These people are staying and they're engaging with this content. Does that mean it's fun? Maybe. Maybe. Maybe Torghast is fun. Or maybe somebody's just doing it because they need Soul Ash. And when Mike from Preach Gaming interviewed Ian, and Ian made it sound like, well, it's not really a problem for people wanting to switch legendaries or any of these things as we move into the next chapter of legendaries. It's not really a big deal because they'll be working on the new chapter of Torghast, which will drop the drops from the current stuff. Like, the idea that, don't worry, they're going to still be on the grind, so the grind will take care of itself, doesn't really answer the core problem. Why is there a grind? Why is Torghast required? They have regularly said that the dev team and the players, both sides, have regularly called out Mage Tower as a rampant success. Mage Tower being individual bosses scaled to the specs within your class, where you had to go through and play in content that was designed to be clearable by you only if you're good at playing your class. Now, of course, some were easier than others, and of course, as gear came in, I think that's what made a lot of people really interested in at the end of the expansion. If it's so beloved by the devs and by the players, why is everything introduced so different than it? It was such a neat idea. The idea, I mean, imagine Final Fantasy XIV players, if you had a piece of content that was the last job or role quest that you unlocked, and you could go clear that on a savage difficulty for a glamored weapon. It doesn't ever get easier. Lock it away like Ultimate. Doesn't ever really get easier. It's just something that's hard. It's always going to scale you down. It's always going to be hard. It's going to punish you into the ground. But it's a glamour, so it doesn't matter. It's cosmetic. It's yours. There's something really neat about that. And for Final Fantasy XIV players to empathize with WoW players for just a second here, this is the equivalent of, imagine if, like you're getting the coins from your Yorha raids right now, your 3 coins to upgrade your augmented Cripplerker set. Imagine if that is the same system that upgraded your Relic, and your Relic was consistently best in slot or close to it every single patch. So if you wanted to clear E4S, 8S, or 12S while they were relevant and new, you had to have your Relic. And the only way to progress your Relic through the entire expansion was clearing deep dungeon floors over and over and over. Not in one big go, a little bit each and every week. Don't miss a week. You'll miss capping out on basically this tombstone of the deep dungeon that you must cap out every single week or you're behind. That's incredibly frustrating. And them softening the curve so you can afford to miss a week doesn't really make it better. The fact that there is a requirement is the problem. And it's not created as an alternate path. It's not created as your choice. The covenants were presented as choice, but then they scaled them so that people felt forced. Torghast is presented as a choice, but then they lock things behind it that people feel needed to do. The Maw is meant to be this choice, but then they lock behind a daily progression. That daily progression you want to do 7 times a week. You feel required to do it. As a druid, I didn't mind the Maw out of the gate. And I didn't understand what all the hate was about. And then I saw somebody say, the only people not complaining about this are druids. And I was like, well, that makes sense. It really wasn't so bad to get around the maw and travel form and be able to stealth and all of that. So, and as a guardian druid, like, it's not like something is going to kill me in one shot. So a death penalty doesn't scare me. So I think that the frustration in these systems with World of Warcraft versus Final Fantasy is not that World of Warcraft isn't listening to players. Somebody said, hey, well, maybe it's just that they're not listening. I don't think it's that straightforward, because the fact that Warlords of Draenor gave way to Legion, which was drastically different, and Legion gave way to BFA, which was drastically different, and BFA gave way to Shadowlands, is drastically different. And every single time they come out in BlizzCon and say, we've heard you, they are listening. I think these knee-jerk reactions prove that they can swing this pendulum so hard. So it's not that they're not listening. They are trying to change too much at once. One of the things I think Final Fantasy does, for long-time veteran players, it can feel very, very repetitive sometimes when a patch is exactly what's expected. But that repetitive consistency is its strength. The fact that when there's a job that's broken, they don't go through and change every job in the battle set. We don't get all 18 jobs, get a massive change in one go, mid-expansion. If something needs to be changed, like Monk's Grease Lightning, that can get its own patch, and then we can wait and see what that does. And so I think it's not that they're not listening, because they are listening. Their reactions are really, really large to what they're hearing. It's not that they're not trying, because clearly it takes effort to put this much content out. Obviously, 9.0 to 9.1 has drawn that into more question than in the past. It's not that they don't care, because there is no way anybody in their right mind goes and works for a company that has had the scandals around the way they've treated their employees, the scandals around people leaving, the scandals around geopolitical and social stigmas, and the way that the company has handled and responded to those, that has had a reputation in its players where people actively hate on the devs, and so every time you Google anything related to your game, you just see people hating on the thing you work on, all so that you can get maybe paid median income for the industry. It's not like Blizzard is paying twice as much as every other dev studio. So you work on Blizzard games because you care about Blizzard games. And so it's not a lack of passion. I think what makes the systems in WoW feel different is that they're required. I think what makes it feel different is that when they do make changes, they don't communicate, here's what we heard. We think there's a number of changes that we'd like to see. Here's the change we're going to implement first. And then at regular, steady, predictable intervals, we are going to continue to make small and minor adjustments to begin moving you in the right direction. We're going to go radio silent for 8 months, giving a handful of interviews, maybe. We're going to effectively pull back into our Willy Wonka factory and not talk to anybody. And then we're going to release this content with these massive changes in some areas and no changes in others, instead of taking small systematic changes within these systems. It's been called system lands, and that none of these systems are required. And so if any of these systems is still falling on its face, is still struggling, it's optional. In Final Fantasy, people go through a ton of the content. People get into Extreme and Savage that never thought they would. They get into Crafting and Gathering that never thought they would. They've tried out bicolor gemstones. They're trying out deep dungeons. They're trying out beast tribes. It's not their style of content. And if they don't like it, they stop doing that content. But it's optional. There's nothing that's required. The reps that you grind with people out in the world, back in TBC, it was do dailies for 2 weeks. Now it's moved into this kind of world quest cache progression type system. And then eventually given way to whatever covenants turn out to be. That system in Final Fantasy, you never have to touch. You do dailies for 2 weeks. It never matured beyond that. It's still that today. It's still that thing. A daily releases and you just do your dailies for 2 weeks and there's a mount that's locked behind it. That's about it. In World of Warcraft, that matured to the point where mid-BFA, you have to go clear dailies. You have to do a certain number of dailies in these certain zones at least once every 3 days, because they're giving you 3 days, which was such a courtesy, but then turns back around and says, you can take up to 3 days, as long as you never, ever, ever miss more than that. And then that's what's resulting in this AP grind. And then when you finish your 3 dailies, the top-end people are encouraged to don't stop. Well, how long to not stop? Until your fingers bleed. And you have to just grind AP into perpetuity. The systems are the same. The difference in the implementation is not in devs caring or devs showing up. It's not in players complaining and devs being willing to make changes, because that happens. We gave away necklaces to get some weird corruption system. Like, that's a drastic shift mid-cycle. It's not that either game doesn't care for its player base, that they make money differently, because that's where the conversation went from there. It's that in one game you feel you have to, and in one game you feel you choose to. And at some point, it's frustrating that WoW hasn't moved back to that. When Torghast was first presented at BlizzCon, Ian, if I remember correctly, talked about this like twisting corridors portion, and he wasn't going to apologize for how hard it was, and it was optional, and it was going to be this thing to challenge yourself. And maybe I'm just misremembering what I stored in my head as, oh my gosh, Mage Tower is coming back, and I'm going to progress through this, it's going to be a little bit required, but at the end of it, I'm going to engage in this system, I'm going to have a better luck going and challenging against this Mage Tower stuff. Last time I got through 3 of my 4 specs on Druid. I want to do it so many more times. I'm so pumped. And then they realized, well, there's not enough retention mechanics and grind mechanics in the game. What are those Torghast guys doing? Get them in here. Let's, have they thought about making their system 100% required by every player? And so it makes it hard to take breaks, which means it takes you to the point where you have to feel it's easy to quit. It doesn't let you take a week off to go play a game that came out from another genre, or to go spend some time in Classic. It doesn't. Taking a break from retail feels like you're punishing your character. And it makes it hard to want to come back. And that's a problem. If I wanted to take a break from my main today in Final Fantasy, I could go into the expansion this November with no regrets. And yet I am still playing 2 to 3 days a week, and will continue doing so for the foreseeable future. And I had a set of goals, and I can already feel myself wanting to move forward that set of goals because I want to. And if at any point I just don't feel like playing for the week, I just won't. And the penalty will be nothing. Like, it's fine. It's fine. It doesn't matter. And I can go 4 or 5 months like this. Now, when the next raid cycle gets here, it's best if I stick with a cycle long enough that I get best in slot, if I was one of those players that wanted to go do that content. But gear progression is much simpler than in WoW. It takes a lot less effort to do that. It takes a lot less doing content outside of the content. For the vast majority of raiders that get their Savage clears relatively early in a cycle, what they have to do between then and the next cycle is keep clearing raids to prepare them for raids until the whole raid has gotten all their drops. And then they get to take a break. Notice, I didn't say anything about Beast Tribe dailies. I didn't say anything about hard mode dungeons. I definitely didn't say anything about PvP. They don't have to craft and gather. Those other systems are there, and they also have grinds and quests and things like that locked behind them. The Crafters and Gatherers built a city this expansion. And if they wanted to be involved in that, they had to craft and to gather. They don't have to run any dungeons or raids to unlock recipes. They don't have to do any of that. It's not that there aren't things locked behind like extreme drops that help them go into making money and things like that, but it's not required. If you want to craft and gather, this expansion you were allowed to craft and gather until your fingers bled. But only the players who opted into that grind chose it. Nobody else was dragged into that. Let people play the way they want to play, and if that's multiple ways, that's great. It lets your game be informed on how people are playing, because you know they're only playing that way because they want to, mostly. And it lets people choose to ignore things. Relic is the closest thing to World of Warcraft required, because many players feel the need to do it for the various cosmetics locked behind it, and some get frustrated at that. It's meant to be grindy. It's designed to be that JRPG aspect. So for people that feel forced to do it, it is a big struggle for them. But the counterpoint to that is nobody told you had to do that. It's not best in slot until best in slot doesn't matter. And honestly, the grind for the fact that you had all expansion to do it wasn't that long. And it definitely wasn't something you had to do every single week. You can clear a whole patch's worth, and you have until the next half patch, and you just take time off. Now, if there's somebody that's like, well, I have to get all the relics for all 18 classes, that's like somebody they saying they have to get all the legendaries on every class in World of Warcraft. That person has chosen to do something insane, and so when it turned out frustrating, I don't really feel bad for them. Like, I don't think the game was designed to make that easy, nor do I think it should be. And so if you're trying to stay best in slot or stay with all the legendaries across, you know, and all of the, whatever they're called, whatever the conduits, and you want to have all of that, if you're trying to do what Kuhn is doing and do all the things across an expansion, don't be shocked if the game puts up a little resistance. Because if it didn't, that would mean that for anybody playing through only one part of the game, they would finish way too fast. So we hop into games because we want something to do. And I think that when it comes to why content's received better, it is because the current tier content, it is so all or nothing in World of Warcraft. And it's what makes me stay on the outside looking in. And Final Fantasy is optional, which makes me feel like it's just something else happening. I don't feel like I'm looking in on something I'm not a part of. I feel like there's things I do and things I don't do, and I don't feel locked out of any of them. I could hop in at any time. As opposed to if I wanted to go hop into a mythic raid right now, I'm just not geared. And that's a problem, and it would require me effort to get there. And if I wanted to be part of the 9.1 race, even for a casual guild, it would require this huge amount of things outside of raid night. And I think that they've let that amount of chores creep up to the point where it feels like a part-time job, and I don't know why I'm paying somebody else $15 a month to get through a job. I like Final Fantasy XIV, and I like World of Warcraft. When you talk about the history of these games, they have both been unbelievably a huge part and impactful on what I have defined as gaming in my life, and for many that I have surrounded myself with. MMOs are a huge part of my life, and I respect a ton of what both WoW and 14 have done. But when asked the question why Torghast is not as successful as Deep Dungeon, in the community's eyes, it's a valid criticism, and there is an answer. That's what I think it is. But compared to the total mountain of content in these games, either way, that's just my opinion, because I'm only playing parts of these games, kinda.